आइए हम बाधा रहित वातावरण का निर्माण करें। सुगम्य भारत अभियान, इसका उद्देश्य है कि देश का प्रत्येक दिव्यांगजन अन्य सामान्य व्यक्तियों के समान स्वावलंबी होकर सम्मान और गरिमा के साथ जीवन यापन करे। सुगम्य भारत, सशक्त भारत।
An inviting atmosphere that nurtures learning, an experienced faculty that inspires students, or the best learning tools, facilities and infrastructure. What makes these institutes so great? Find out on Skill Tree Presents Great Indian Institutes at these times only on CNBC TV 18.
Presented by Skill Tree Global Knowledge Consortium.
Good afternoon and welcome to Business Saturday in the Mumbai News Centre. I am Ridhima Bhatnagar. Let's kickstart this bulletin with a quick check of all the headlines. Strong gains on Wall Street led by better than expected jobs data. Nasdaq S&P 500 closed at all-time highs. Europe too closes with gains.
Could be 16.9 to 18.9.
The GST rate may not necessarily be high or low, but it will be fair and moderate, promises the Finance Minister Arun Jaitley. Says the CEA panel's assumptions when arriving at 18% may need a relook, but nothing drastic. Confirms that many states have asked for a GST rate of at least 21 to 24% to limit revenue losses.
I think he created an impact. He's leaving a good legacy behind. And I wish him all the very best.
Arun Jaitley lauds Raghuram Rajan for his work at the RBI. Says the new RBI governor's job will be to get the struggling banking sector back on track. IT giant Cognizant cuts its revenue guidance for 2017 for the second straight quarter, even as the top-line growth comes in at just a little over 5% in the second quarter. American pharmaceutical watchdog US FDA raises the red flag on Wockhardt, sends out an import alert on the company's Ankleshwar plant for non-compliance with good manufacturing practices. Well, those were the headlines. But first up, let's get all the action from the global markets. US stocks closed sharply higher on Friday, with the S&P and the Nasdaq posting their strongest close ever after a stronger than expected jobs report. Now, the jobs report for the month of July came in much higher than expected. The US economy added 255,000 jobs in July. The employment rate still remains unchanged at 4.9%. Josh Lipton now wraps up all the action on Wall Street.
For CNBC TV 18, I'm Josh Lipton. U.S. markets closing in the green today. The S&P and Nasdaq finishing at record highs. The Dow rallying 191 points, the S&P up 18, and the Nasdaq gaining 55 points. Good news for the U.S. economy. The Labor Department reporting it added 255,000 jobs in July, clocking in well above the 180,000 estimated. The biggest job creators, professional and business services with 70,000 new positions, and leisure and hospitality with 45,000 new jobs. The unemployment rate remained steady at 4.9%, while wages ticked slightly higher. And Bristol Myers Squibb shares plunging when the company's blockbuster cancer drug Opdivo failed in a late-stage study. Bristol's attempt to extend usage of the drug for lung cancer patients failed, and the negative results now put rival drug maker Merck in the lead for treating cancer patients with immunotherapy. And finally, a 1938 edition of Superman Action Comic #1 selling in auction for $956,000. Written by Jerry Siegel and illustrated by Joe Shuster, it features Superman lifting a car on its cover. It is considered the holy grail of comic books, with only 100 copies known to exist. That's the action from the U.S. market. Now back to you in Mumbai.
Well, let's now get you some expert opinion on what to really expect from the Fed post a strong jobs report.
Raised our probabilities a little bit, both for September and cumulatively for the year. We still think December has a higher probability than September, but we do think it's about 1 in 3 that there will be a hike in September. I'm more constructive. I would say GDP numbers are pretty noisy.
More jobs, more hours, more wages, more participation. But Janet Yellen has been, and her doves have been going out of the way looking for reasons not to raise rates. And this is what she's going to focus on. She's going to say, you know, 60% of the job growth in the service sector is in hospitality, healthcare, administrative services. Those are low-paying wages. And she's also going to say, we're not sure whether this job growth is going to translate into real growth and mainly into inflation. That's the thing that she's really looking for. And so far, there's no sign of real inflation showing up. So she's going to say, we need more confirming data. We need to see the whites of their eyes before we move.
Let's now get to the big CNBC TV 18 exclusive. Finance Minister Arun Jaitley acknowledges the fact that it won't be any easy task for the government to roll out GST from the 1st of April 2017, but says an honest effort is being made by all to try and meet the deadline, conceding that passing the GST constitutional amendment bill in the parliament is just one step off the process. Shireen Bhan caught up with him and started off by asking him how he managed the impossible, that is, getting a political consensus, a feat which his two predecessors have failed to achieve.
My honest intention always was to do it with a consensus as large as possible. And I explained the reasons for that in Parliament. The GST is not a partisan proposal. Every party in some way or the other has supported it. There are political issues which are holding it back. At the same time, you have every party which is a part of the governance structure, either at the center or the states. The Congress has state governments, the Samajwadi Party is there, the left has state governments, you have the JDU, the Biju Janata Dal, the TDP, the TRS, the Trinamool. And you can't have a couple of state governments adopting a negative attitude.
Sure.
And then it won't work. So even though these were positioning exercises that we have the numbers, etc., because factually between the NDA and the regional parties which were supporting, we did have the numbers.
Yes.
But still the intention and the priority was to do it with a larger consensus.
I think the chief economic advisor was one of the most talked about people in the parliamentary debate that we saw in the Rajya Sabha. You very clearly just mentioned that you want a fair rate. You also said that you want a reasonable rate. The Revenue Secretary yesterday in his press conference said that we would not like an obnoxious rate. What are we all given to understand that to mean?
I don't think we can pinpoint a rate. The chief economic advisor, after he made his calculations, and that was a committee, that was not personal to him, indicated that the standard rate could be 16.9 to 18.9, which means approximately 17 to 19.
Sure.
Now you'll add a little to it because these were based on the 2013-14 data, and some cesses have been added thereafter.
Right.
You'll also have to add to it some quantum required for compensation to the states. And therefore, let's assume that that's the range or a little more which the chief economic advisor felt. He made a detailed presentation to the state empowered committee. That's the state finance ministers. And I can tell you it's an institution which is being built up very well. This is not an institution where you can just talk and everybody will accept what your suggestion is. So there was a continuous discussion and so on. And then they realized that presently, almost 80% plus of the items as far as the central government is concerned are on a standard rate of 12.5% excise duty. More than 60% items of the state on a VAT of 14.5, which takes you to 27. Then there are other small taxes in the states particularly. There are countervailing duties, there are other taxes. So some states said it moves today upwards of 30. Now, how do we immediately cut down so radically? And this was the concern of the states, that we are at the end of the day starved of revenue. And to what extent will the center be able to support us? We have developmental needs.
Sure.
We have the pay commission recommendations. We have the poverty alleviation schemes. We don't want to be tied down in our governance merely because we switched over a taxation system. A good response was that the base of taxation will increase, the leakages will be plucked, there will be a more efficient system. That will lead to some gains. You won't have the cascading impact of tax on tax. That will be an advantage. There will be many commodities which are the low tax commodities, so this average will go down. And collectively, these three factors at least will bring down this rate from its present level. Then the state started throwing up their own back of the envelope calculations.
If I may throw some of those calculations to you, sir, because we've had a plethora of state finance ministers on the channel. For instance, Thomas Isaac, the Kerala finance minister, said very clearly that anything less than 24% will not be acceptable to him. What would be an appropriate or a fair rate given what the states have put forward?
I'm not an expert and I won't hazard a guess. So their range was from 21 to 24 and so on. That's the kind of range the states have. Arvind's viewpoint was distinctively different. Now, as I mentioned to you, the Congress party and the government, we had serious discussions on this issue. It's not merely a political adjustment.
Sure.
Both these sets of figures were explained to them in detail. The presentations were shown to them. And therefore, perhaps it's too early for us to reach a conclusion as to what the figure would be.
As far as the CA panel recommendations are concerned, the CA did say that some of the assumptions, or he didn't factor in some of the assumptions that you just spoke about, the cesses and so on and so forth. So should we expect a reworking of his report?
No. I think his report should be seen on its own merits. At that time when he was working, the 13-14 data in detail was available, so he worked on it. How that translates on basis of the 15-16 data,
sure,
I think you'll have to evolve.
Okay.
Secondly, the idea of compensation was born thereafter.
In terms of compensation, so it is our understanding that again at the Empowered State Finance Ministers meeting, there was some sort of a broad decision on the way that compensation ought to be calculated. Has there been any agreement on the way that compensation will be calculated?
Clear. You see, compensation has been one of the deal enablers.
I know you haven't given a commitment on being able to roll out the GST on the 1st of April 2017, but given where things stand and given your conversations with various parties, do you believe that that is a realistic timeline, or do you believe it's a tough timeline to achieve?
Getting it ratified by the states is not difficult. It will be done. I think there are three different kinds of exercises which will be on. One is the conclusion of the IT support that is required, which they say is at a fairly advanced stage. People don't see much of a problem in that. The second is the drafting of the three laws, approval of the two laws by Parliament, and one law by each of the state assemblies. Now that's going to be a time-consuming process. And thirdly, on the rate, as also on some technical procedures as to overlapping jurisdictions and so on, how to resolve the issue of dual control.
Has there been any meeting of minds as far as the issue of dual control is concerned?
I think it's converging towards a solution. It's converging towards a solution.
Are states willing to concede, or is the centre willing to concede?
No, it's not a question of conceding, who concedes. I think both are clear that the same assessee can't be assessed twice over.
Do you get any more comfort as far as the bank's NPA situation is concerned today?
Well, I would say it is still a matter of concern. The banks are acting, they're trying to take steps, but the NPAs in those sectors are huge and the provisioning process is continuing. Therefore, but a lot of banks have actually shown operational profit. Now, some of the banks this quarter have not only shown operational profit, but even after provisioning have shown profit. So there is some turnaround taking place.
We've got the credit policy, and this is the last credit policy under Raghuram Rajan. I won't ask you what you expect on the 9th of August, but let me ask you this in the context where things are globally as well as locally. Do you believe that there is room for rates to come down?
Well, I think the RBI is going to announce it in a couple of days, and therefore it's not fair for me to really make a comment.
Sure. How challenging do you believe it's going to be for you, for the government as well as the Reserve Bank, to work together through the MPC to keep this 4% target? And should we assume then, because we're nudging closer to the 6% level even today as far as inflation is concerned, is that going to really be the upper end, is where we see inflation?
I hope so, unless some extraordinary situations develop. And even this 5.7, 5.8% has really been contributed by one or two particular factors: pulses, vegetables. And I think with the kind of acreage of pulses growth, with the incentives which the government has provided, I think over the next couple of months, the pulses prices from all available reports indicate are going to come down.
Well, time to slip into a very short break. But coming up, IT giant Cognizant cuts its revenue guidance for 2017 for the second straight quarter. All those details when we get back. Stay tuned.
The first look